Dad, please do not call 911. I did not do anything. But he believed my sister's lies and let the police take me away. For 12 months in prison, not a single family member came to see me. The day I was finally released was the day they lost everything. My name is Maya. I am 32 years old and I run a highly successful private equity firm in Atlanta. But 5 years ago, I was the family scapegoat who took the fall for a golden child and her fraudulent husband. Before I tell you how I tore down my family's perfect facade and took everything they valued, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe karma always collects its debts. Right now, I am sitting in my penthouse overlooking the Atlanta skyline. The city lights reflect in my glass of red wine, and I cannot help but smile at the irony of it all. I have wealth, power, and absolute freedom. But to understand the depth of the betrayal that put me behind bars, you have to understand the suffocating world I grew up in. My family was the absolute epitome of Atlanta's elite. We represented a very specific brand of high society excellence. My father Marcus was a former judge who valued his pristine public image above his own children. His entire life was a performance of respectability. My mother Valerie was the ultimate socialite. She spent her days hosting charity galas and attending exclusive country club luncheons where she paraded our family's supposedly perfect life for everyone to envy. In their house, reputation was religion and saving face was the only law that mattered. And then there was Chloe. My younger sister was 29 at the time and the undeniable golden child of the family. Chloe was a former sorority queen who had never worked a hard day in her life, but somehow always managed to afford designer bags, luxury vacations, and imported cars. She knew exactly how to manipulate my parents, playing the role of the perfect compliant daughter. She was their pride and joy, mostly because she married Brad. Brad was a 34-year-old white man who presented himself as a brilliant cryptocurrency investment advisor. My parents practically worshipped the ground he walked on. They genuinely believed his presence elevated our family status. They loved showing him off at their extravagant dinner parties, bragging to their friends about his supposed financial genius and his elite connections. But I worked in the financial sector, and I knew a total fraud when I saw one. Brad was a parasite. I was drowning in hidden debts, constantly chasing the next big illegal score while living off my family's wealth and credit. I tried to warn my parents multiple times. I sat my father down and told him that Brad's investment strategies made absolutely no sense. But my father just looked at me with pure disgust. He told me I was just an ungrateful daughter who was bitterly jealous of my sister's perfect marriage. In my parents' eyes, I was just the cynical, rebellious child who refused to play their high society game. I chose to build my own career instead of marrying into money, so they barely tolerated me. I was the outsider in my own home. Everything shattered completely on a stormy Tuesday night. The rain was coming down in aggressive, blinding sheets, washing the dark Atlanta streets in a cold, slick glare. It was exactly 2 in the morning when my phone vibrated loudly on my nightstand. The sudden harsh noise jolted me awake from a deep sleep. I rubbed my eyes, glanced at the glowing screen, and saw Chloe's name flashing. We had not spoken in several weeks. Our last interaction ended in a screaming match when she demanded I loan Brad $50,000 for a temporary liquidity issue, and I flatly refused to fund his scams. I almost ignored the call, letting it go to voicemail, but a strange cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. Against my better judgment, I swiped the screen to answer. Before I could even say a single word, a piercing, hysterical scream filled my ear. "Maya, please help us!" Chloe was hyperventilating, her voice shrill and completely unhinged with panic. "You have to come right now. Maya, please, I am bleeding." I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart immediately hammering against my ribs. The resentment I held for her vanished in an instant, replaced by pure adrenaline. "Chloe, calm down. What happened? Where are you?" "We crashed. Brad lost control of the car." Chloe sobbed hysterically, her words stumbling over each other in a frantic rush. "The car is totally smashed, Maya. We are on Monroe Drive near the old shopping plaza. Please, you are the only one who answers their phone at this hour. Do not call Mom and Dad. Dad will kill us if he finds out Brad was driving like this. Please just come get me. I am so scared and we need you." against every logical instinct that told me to stay far away from Brad and his chaotic, destructive life. My protective older sister reflex kicked into overdrive. Despite how terribly Chloe treated me, despite how much she looked down on my life, she was still my blood, and she sounded genuinely terrified. I threw off my warm blankets, grabbed my car keys, and sprinted out the front door without even bothering to change out of my loose sweatpants and oversized shirt. I did not pause to ask any more questions, I just moved. The drive through the dark, rain-slicked streets of Atlanta was a suffocating blur of anxiety and dread. My windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the heavy downpour. The rhythmic thumping of the rain matched the racing pulse in my chest. My mind spun with terrible dark possibilities. Were they severely injured? Was Brad driving under the influence of drugs again? Why was Chloe so incredibly desperate to keep our image-obsessed father out of it? My hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached with the pressure. I pushed my car well over the speed limit, blowing through yellow lights and empty intersections as I navigated toward Monroe Drive. I kept repeating a simple plan in my head. I would just pick them up, make sure they were physically okay, and drop them off at a local emergency room if they needed medical attention. I had absolutely no intention of getting deeply involved in whatever mess Brad had created this time. I was just going to be the responsible older sister and then wash my hands of the situation. But as I turned the sharp corner onto the deserted commercial street, the grim reality of the situation came into view, and it was far worse than a simple late-night fender bender. The flashing yellow traffic lights illuminated a scene of complete and utter destruction. Brad's expensive black luxury SUV had completely jumped the elevated curb and plowed straight through the heavy glass storefront of a closed retail shop. Shattered glass covered the wet pavement, glittering dangerously in the streetlights. The entire front end of the heavy vehicle was violently crumpled against a concrete support pillar deep inside the ruined store. A broken street lamp flickered ominously overhead, casting long, distorted shadows across the smoking wreckage. The air smelled strongly of burnt rubber and leaking engine fluid. I slammed on my brakes and threw my car into park, leaving the engine running and the high beams shining directly onto the crash site to cut through the dark night. Freezing rain soaked through my thin clothes the exact second I stepped out of my vehicle, but I did not even care. I ran as fast as I could toward the shattered storefront, my heavy boots crunching loudly over the thick carpet of broken glass and twisted metal. I fully expected to find my sister trapped in the passenger seat and severely injured. I expected to find a tragic accidental scene. I never expected to find the calculated, sinister trap that would completely destroy my freedom. I tore the passenger door open so violently, the metal hinges shrieked in protest. I was bracing myself for a horrific sight, expecting my sister to be crushed against the dashboard covered in blood, just like she had screamed on the phone. Instead, Chloe was sitting perfectly upright in the leather seat. She was breathing heavily, shaking like a leaf in a storm, but she was entirely unharmed. There was not a single drop of blood on her pristine clothes. Her flawless makeup was not even smudged by the deployment of the airbag. She had lied to get me here. Before I could even demand an explanation, I noticed Brad. He was not checking on his wife. He was not dialing emergency services or assessing the structural damage to the store he had just demolished. He was standing at the rear of the mangled luxury SUV, tearing frantically at the jammed mechanism of the heavy liftgate. He looked like a wild animal clawing at a cage. I grabbed Chloe by the shoulders and pulled her out into the freezing rain, demanding to know exactly where she was bleeding. She just stared at me with massive, terrified eyes and pointed a shaking, manicured finger toward the back of the vehicle. At that exact moment, the crushed rear door of the SUV finally gave way with a loud metallic snap, springing upward into the dark sky. The sheer force of the collision had severely damaged the latch, causing the trunk to burst wide open. The contents violently spilled out onto the wet asphalt directly under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the broken street lamp. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I completely froze. Two massive black hard-shell suitcases had been ejected from the cargo area. The violent impact had shattered the combination lock on one of them, popping it wide open for the world to see. It was not filled with designer clothes or expensive laptops. It was filled to the brim with banded stacks of $100 bills. And scattered across the wet pavement, rolling into the dirty, shimmering puddles of rainwater, were dozens of tightly wrapped plastic bricks of illegal contraband. I stood there in the pouring rain, staring at the undeniable physical proof of Brad's entire existence. The cold, wet reality washed over me, and every single puzzle piece clicked into place with sickening, absolute clarity. The mysterious cryptocurrency investments that never had any legitimate public records. The sudden influx of cash whenever he needed to impress my parents at their country club dinners. The aggressive, erratic demands for a $50,000 loan just a few weeks ago. Brad was not a brilliant financial advisor. He was a low-level criminal. I was using my family's pristine social standing and their legitimate businesses to launder extremely dirty money. He was actively using my father's spotless reputation as a former judge as an invisible shield to run an illegal empire right under their noses. And my parents, who were so completely blinded by their desperate desire to parade a wealthy white son-in-law around their elite social circles, had handed him the keys to the castle. Brad dropped to his knees in the mud, frantically scooping up the soaking wet bricks of merchandise and shoving them back into the cracked suitcase. His expensive tailored suit was ruined, soaked with rain and leaking engine oil. He looked completely pathetic. He was cursing under his breath, his hands shaking so badly he kept dropping the bundles of cash back into the puddles. I turned my head to look at Chloe, fully expecting her to be screaming in horror at what her husband had been hiding in their trunk. But she was not shocked. She was not surprised in the slightest. She immediately dropped to her knees right beside him, dragging her expensive coat through the mud and glass, helping him gather the illegal merchandise. She knew. My perfect golden child sister, the absolute darling of Atlanta high society, knew exactly how her husband funded her lavish lifestyle. She knew where the money for her designer bags and her luxury vacations came from. She was entirely complicit in this massive federal crime. A cold, furious clarity washed over my entire body, pushing away the cold of the freezing rain. I had warned my parents for years. I had looked at his fake financial portfolios and told my father the numbers were completely fabricated. I had endured years of being called a cynical, jealous failure because I refused to buy into the grand illusion of this mediocre man they worshipped. And here he was crawling in the dirty street, desperately trying to hide evidence that would land them all in federal prison. I stepped forward, purposefully crushing a banded stack of wet bills beneath the heavy heel of my boot. Brad snapped his head up, his eyes wide and panicked. He lunged forward, trying to push my leg away from the money, but I stood my ground, glaring down at him with absolute disgust. I demanded to know exactly whose money this was and how much trouble they had brought to my doorstep. Brad started babbling incoherently. He claimed it was just a massive misunderstanding. He claimed he was simply holding the packages for a very important wealthy client. He begged me to help them load the broken suitcases into the back of my car. He told me we needed to leave the scene immediately before the local police arrived. He actually had the sheer audacity to order me to put the illegal items into my own clean vehicle to save his pathetic skin. I let out a harsh, bitter laugh that cut right through the noise of the heavy rain. I pulled out my phone and told them I was leaving. I told them they were going to stay right here in the mud and explain this entire mess to the authorities. I turned my back on them, fully intending to walk back to my car, lock the doors, and drive far away from this radioactive disaster. I owed them absolutely nothing. They had made their reckless choices, and now they could face the brutal consequences alone. But the moment I turned my back, the piercing wail of police sirens tore through the night air. The sound was distant at first, but it was rapidly growing louder, echoing aggressively off the brick walls of the empty shopping plaza. Someone in the nearby residential area had heard the explosive crash. Someone had already called it in. Red and blue lights began to reflect brightly against the low-hanging storm clouds in the distance. The police were only seconds away, and I was standing right in the middle of a massive crime scene. 3 patrol cars swerved into the shopping plaza parking lot, their tires screeching violently against the wet asphalt. The blinding red and blue strobe lights cut through the heavy rain, throwing harsh, jagged shadows across the brick walls and the shattered glass. Doors flew open before the vehicles even came to a complete stop. Officers poured out, shouting commands that echoed sharply in the cold night air, ordering everyone to freeze and put their hands where they could be seen. Brad kicked the broken suitcase away from his knees, as if the money and the contraband had suddenly caught fire. He threw his hands high into the air. In a split second, his entire demeanor completely transformed. The desperate, scrambling criminal vanished and was instantly replaced by a terrified, innocent civilian. He grabbed Chloe and pulled her against his chest, shielding her in a perfectly choreographed display of being a protective husband. Chloe began to sob. It was not the hysterical, panicked screaming from the phone call. It was a loud, theatrical wail designed specifically for an audience. She buried her face in Brad's ruined suit jacket, shaking uncontrollably. An officer approached with his flashlight raised, cutting through the darkness and illuminating the massive pile of cash and illegal packages scattered on the ground. He demanded to know whose vehicle it was and what exactly was going on. Brad did not even hesitate. He raised a shaking finger and pointed it directly at my chest. He told the officers that I was the driver. He claimed that he and Chloe had been at a party and had simply called me for a ride home because it was raining. He swore they had absolutely no idea what I was transporting in the trunk. He put on a flawless performance playing the deeply shocked and betrayed brother-in-law. He knew exactly how to play the system. I knew his tailored suit, his background, and his polished vocabulary would automatically grant him the benefit of the doubt with the responding officers. Chloe turned her tear-stained face toward the police and nodded frantically, backing up his absurd lie. My own flesh and blood pointed at me and cried out that I had lost control of the car because I was driving recklessly. She begged the officers to believe them, claiming they were just innocent passengers trapped in my terrifying high-speed accident. She looked the lead officer dead in the eyes and stated with absolute conviction that the illegal merchandise belonged entirely to me. The air physically left my lungs. I stood completely frozen, the icy rain soaking through to my skin, unable to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the betrayal unfolding right in front of me. The sister I had rushed out in the middle of the night to protect was feeding me directly to the wolves without a single ounce of hesitation. She was perfectly willing to send me to federal prison for decades just to save her worthless husband and protect her fragile high society image. She was willing to let me lose my career, my freedom, and my entire life so she could keep wearing designer clothes funded by dirty money. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to scream the truth about Brad's fake financial empire and his hidden debts, but the officers were already moving in. They did not want to hear my side of the story. They saw the scene exactly the way Brad wanted them to see it. The narrative was already written in their minds. An officer grabbed my arms and wrenched them harshly behind my back. The cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs locked around my wrists, biting sharply into my skin. I tried to speak, but a rough hand pushed my shoulder, forcing me to turn around. I looked at Chloe one last time as they read me my rights. The theatrical tears were still flowing down her cheeks for the benefit of the police, but her eyes were completely dry and entirely devoid of remorse. She stared right back at me with a cold, blank expression. She had made her choice. She had sacrificed me to save herself, and she was not going to lose a single minute of sleep over it. The harsh red and blue lights continued to sweep across the devastated storefront, painting the wet pavement in chaotic bursts of color. I stood completely still, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting deep into my wrists. I watched the freezing rain drip from the visor of the arresting officer when a sleek silver luxury sedan cut abruptly through the police barricade. It parked haphazardly near the edge of the crime scene, disregarding the yellow tape. The heavy doors swung open and my parents stepped out into the raging storm. Marcus and Valerie had arrived. Chloe must have called them the exact second the crash happened, long before she ever dialed my number. She had orchestrated this entire performance with terrifying precision. She knew exactly how to set the stage and exactly who to call to guarantee her own survival. My mother, Valerie, rushed forward in her pristine cashmere coat, completely ignoring the broken glass and the puddles of dirty oil. Chloe immediately broke away from Brad and threw herself into my mother's arms, sobbing loudly. Valerie wrapped her expensive coat around Chloe, shielding her from the freezing rain, and glared at me with absolute unbridled contempt. She looked at me not as her eldest daughter, but as a dangerous, unstable criminal who had deliberately tried to harm her precious golden child. I turned my desperate gaze toward my father. Marcus stepped forward, his posture rigid, and his expression carved from solid stone. He was a former judge, a man who had built his entire identity and fortune on the pillars of strict respectability and a flawless public image. I fully expected him to ask questions. I expected him to look at the massive pile of illegal drugs and the ridiculous amount of banded cash and demand a logical explanation. I expected him to use his brilliant legal mind to see right through Brad's absurd, frantic lies. "Dad, you have to listen to me." I stepped forward, my voice shaking with cold and rising panic. "Brad crashed the car. I just drove here to pick them up 5 minutes ago. The money and the drugs belong entirely to him. He has been using your name to launder dirty money. You have to tell the police to check the vehicle registration and look at the cameras." Marcus did not look at the crashed SUV. He did not look at the scattered cash or the illegal merchandise rolling in the mud. He looked exclusively at the heavy steel handcuffs locking my wrists together. He saw the police officers surrounding me. He saw his perfect family image teetering on the edge of complete public destruction. The world seemed to spin around me in a slow, dizzying circle, isolating me in the center of the flashing lights and the pouring rain. I was completely trapped in a nightmare, while the people who were supposed to protect me closed ranks against me. And then he raised his hand. The slap echoed sharply over the sound of the heavy rain and the idling police engines. The sheer physical force of the blow snapped my head violently to the side. A sharp ringing sound filled my ears, and the metallic taste of blood instantly bloomed on my bottom lip. I stumbled backward, my bound hands useless to break my fall. An officer quickly grabbed my arm to keep me upright, but I barely registered the rough grip. The physical pain radiating across my cheek was absolutely nothing compared to the catastrophic emotional shock that tore right through my chest. "I told you to stop associating with the absolute scum of this city." Marcus spat the words at me, his voice trembling with pure, untethered rage. "I told you your rebellious, cynical lifestyle would bring absolute ruin to this family. You are a complete disgrace." "Dad, I did not do this." I pleaded, the hot tears finally mixing with the freezing rain on my face. "You know Brad is a massive fraud. You know I would never touch anything like this. Look at my car. It does not have a single scratch on it." Marcus turned his back on me, completely cutting off my words in my defense. He adjusted his damp suit jacket and walked straight toward the lead investigating officer. He stood tall, utilizing every single ounce of authoritative power he had cultivated over decades in the courtroom. He introduced himself as former Judge Marcus and extended his firm hand. The lead officer recognized the prominent name immediately, and his defensive posture instantly relaxed into a stance of deep professional respect. "Officer, I am deeply sorry for the terrible trouble my eldest daughter has caused tonight." Marcus spoke with a smooth, commanding tone that carried perfectly through the noisy storm. "Maya has always been a deeply troubled individual. We have spent years trying to correct her destructive path, but she absolutely refuses to listen to reason. She has always been bitterly jealous of her younger sister. My son-in-law, Brad, and my daughter Chloe are upstanding, highly respected members of the Atlanta community. They are completely innocent victims who simply made the terrible mistake of accepting a ride from a reckless driver who was clearly under the influence." I could not breathe. My lungs completely forgot how to function. My own father was actively, eagerly handing me over to the authorities. I was wrapping me in a neat little package and feeding me directly to the justice system, just to ensure the scandal bypassed his favorite daughter and his fake investment guru son-in-law. He was using his immense legal influence to cement the false narrative before the detectives even started their paperwork. I was putting the final nail in my coffin so Chloe could walk away without a single scratch on her pristine reputation. The lead officer nodded sympathetically, writing down every single word my father said in his notepad. When a former judge actively vouches for the victims and publicly condemns the suspect, the investigation is practically over before it even begins. The police had their criminal. They had their neat, tidy story. They had absolutely no reason to dig any deeper into Brad's shady finances or question why my car, parked a few yards away, had zero front-end damage. A rough hand pushed firmly against the back of my head and shoved me down into the cramped back seat of the police cruiser. The heavy door slammed shut with a definitive metallic thud, sealing me in the dark, confined space. The thick plexiglass partitions separated me from the front seats, muffling the sounds of the outside world. I pressed my bleeding face against the cold, wet window. Outside, the rain continued to fall, relentless gray sheets. I watched my family standing together under the harsh glare of the streetlights. Valerie was gently stroking Chloe's hair, whispering soothing words into her ear. Brad had his arm wrapped protectively around his wife, offering a small, subtle smirk when he knew the police officers were not looking in his direction. Marcus stood tall and proud, shaking the lead officer's hand one final time to seal the deal. They looked like a beautiful, united family leaning on each other after a terrible, unavoidable tragedy. They were a picture-perfect masterpiece built entirely on my absolute destruction. The police cruiser shifted heavily into gear and pulled away from the shattered storefront. The flashing red and blue lights slowly faded into the distance, leaving my family behind in the dark parking lot. I sat completely alone in the back of the moving car, the tight steel handcuffs digging mercilessly into my bruised skin. I did not cry anymore. The shock and the frantic panic slowly drained out of my body, leaving behind a cold, hardened void. They had made their choice tonight, and now I had to make mine. The concrete walls of the holding precinct felt like they were slowly closing in on me, pressing the freezing damp air directly into my lungs. The harsh fluorescent light buzzing directly above my head cast sickening yellow shadows across the scarred metal table bolted to the floor. I sat on the cold steel bench, rubbing my raw wrists where the handcuffs had finally been removed. I was waiting for my salvation. I was waiting for the high-priced defense attorney my father kept on retainer to burst through that heavy iron door, demand my immediate release, and tear the police department apart for false arrest. Instead, the heavy door clanked open, and Richard Sterling stepped into the claustrophobic interrogation room. Richard was my father's personal fixer. I was a man who wore $5,000 bespoke suits and possessed a moral compass completely dictated by whoever signed his massive retainer checks. He did not look at me with sympathy or concern. He looked at me the exact same way one looks at a stain on a very expensive rug. He set his pristine leather briefcase on the dirty metal table and sat down across from me. He did not ask if I was injured. He did not ask for my version of the events that led to my arrest. He simply snapped the golden clasps of his briefcase open, pulled out a thick stack of stapled legal documents, and slid them directly across the table until they touched my folded hands. I stared at the bold black letters printed across the top page. It was a formal plea agreement. I looked up at him, my voice raspy and completely drained of emotion. "What is this, Richard? Where is the motion for discovery? Where is the demand for the parking lot security footage?" Brad set me up. He was laundering money and trafficking narcotics. "You need to subpoena his bank records right now." Richard folded his manicured hands, resting them on top of his briefcase. His expression remained entirely blank, a perfectly constructed wall of legal indifference. "We are not doing any of that, Maya." He spoke in a low, calm voice that somehow made the small room feel even more suffocating. "Your father has given me very specific instructions regarding how we are going to handle this unfortunate situation. You are going to sign this document. You are going to plead guilty to a lesser charge of reckless endangerment and possession. With my connections and your father's pristine reputation, we have already negotiated a highly favorable deal with the district attorney. You will serve exactly 12 months in a minimum security facility." I stared at him, absolutely dumbfounded by the sheer audacity of his words. 12 months in federal prison. I spat, my voice echoing harshly against the concrete walls. "You want me to admit to federal crimes I did not commit to save a parasitic fraud who is actively draining my family's bank accounts? Are you completely insane? I will take this to a jury. I will take the stand and I will tear Brad's entire fake empire to pieces in open court." Richard did not flinch. He leaned forward slowly, invading my limited personal space, the faint smell of his expensive cologne completely overpowering the stale air of the interrogation room. "If you choose to go to trial, your father will completely disown you." He stated the threat with terrifying absolute certainty. "Marcus will publicly testify that you have a long documented history of severe substance abuse and erratic behavior. Chloe and Brad will take the stand and swear under oath that you forced them into that car. You will be facing a hostile jury, a corrupt narrative, and a highly motivated prosecution team completely backed by a former judge. You will not get 12 months, Maya. You will get 20 years. A cold, paralyzing dread washed over me. I was completely trapped in a rigged game, and the dealer was my own father. But Richard was not finished. He had saved the ultimate weapon for last. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, sliding it across the table to sit right next to the plea deal. Your sister is pregnant, Maya. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I stared at the small ultrasound printout resting on the metal table. The blurry black and white image meant absolutely nothing to me, but the calculated timing of its reveal meant everything. Chloe found out 3 days ago. Richard continued, his voice dropping to a smooth, manipulative whisper. She is in a highly fragile state. The doctors have clearly stated that any severe emotional distress could cause her to lose the baby. Your parents have made their position absolutely crystal clear. If you drag your sister into a brutal public trial, if you force her to sit on a witness stand and endure grueling cross-examination about her husband's alleged criminal activities, the stress will trigger a miscarriage. I sat frozen, my mind racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour, piecing the sinister puzzle together. Brad was an absolute mastermind of psychological manipulation. He knew the walls were closing in on his fraudulent cryptocurrency schemes. He knew the massive debts he owed to dangerous people were coming due. He needed the ultimate human shield to guarantee my parents' absolute blind loyalty. A pregnancy was the perfect untouchable armor. Whether the pregnancy was real or just another brilliantly fabricated lie orchestrated by Brad and a paid-off doctor did not matter in the slightest. What mattered was that my parents believed it. They were fiercely aggressively protecting their golden child and their unborn grandchild. Your father asked me to deliver a very specific message. Richard said, his cold eyes locking onto mine. He said that if you fight this plea deal, if you destroy your sister's marriage and cause the death of his first grandchild, he will spend every single cent of his considerable fortune, ensuring you never see the light of day again. You will not just be a convicted felon, Maya. You will be the monster who killed your own sister's baby. But if you take the deal, if you quietly accept the 12 months, Marcus will ensure your legal fees are covered, and he will set up a modest private stipend for you when you are released. The sheer psychological violence of the ultimatum was breathtaking. They were using a highly convenient, potentially fake pregnancy to emotionally blackmail me into taking the fall for a massive federal crime. They were holding me completely hostage in a windowless room, stripping away every single one of my fundamental rights and offering me a prison cell as a twisted act of family mercy. I looked down at the plea agreement. The stark white paper seemed to mock me. If I fought them right now, I would be fighting completely alone against a highly connected former judge, a team of ruthless corporate lawyers, and a sister willing to perjure herself to protect her lavish lifestyle. My own defense attorney was actively working to secure my conviction. The entire justice system had been weaponized against me by the very man who used to preside over it. I had zero leverage. I had no access to my funds, no way to hire an independent legal team, and absolutely no time to gather evidence before the arraignment. If I went to trial, I would lose. I would be locked away for decades, and Brad would continue to bleed my family dry while playing the innocent victim. I needed to survive this exact moment. I needed to accept the tactical loss in order to secure the ultimate strategic victory. I needed them to drop their guard and believe they had completely destroyed me. I picked up the cheap plastic pen resting next to the legal documents. My hand was not shaking anymore. The frantic, terrified girl who had rushed into the freezing rain to save her sister was completely dead. The woman sitting in the metal chair was cold, calculating, and entirely focused on absolute survival. Tell my father I accept his generous offer. I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet monotone. Tell him I will take the 12 months. Tell Chloe I wish her a very healthy pregnancy. Richard offered a tight, satisfied smile, clearly pleased that he had successfully bullied another victim into submission. He pushed the documents closer to me and pointed at the signature line. Good choice, Maya. I will let your parents know you decided to do the right thing for the family. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name, sealing my fate and trading a year of my life for my immediate survival. As Richard packed the signed documents back into his expensive leather briefcase and turned to leave the claustrophobic room, I stared at his retreating back. I was going to prison. I was going to lose my freedom, my spotless record, and my current life. But they had made one massive, catastrophic miscalculation. They assumed 12 months behind bars would break me. They had no idea that throwing me into the absolute dark would only give me the perfect cover to meticulously plot their total financial and social annihilation. I was not just going away, I was going to war. The transition from the claustrophobic interrogation room to the sprawling mahogany-paneled courtroom happened with terrifying speed. When a highly connected former judge pulls the strings of the justice system, the wheels turn with absolute ruthless efficiency. I barely had time to process the suffocating reality of my plea deal before I was ushered into the stark fluorescent lighting of the courtroom. I was dressed in a standard-issue drab suit, sitting at the heavy wooden defense table next to Richard Sterling. I was instructed to keep my head down and my hands folded. I was supposed to look like a broken, defeated woman facing the righteous consequences of her terrible actions. Looking up at the elevated witness box, I watched Brad take the stand. He looked like the absolute embodiment of corporate success and unshakable morality. He wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit with a crisp white shirt and a conservative silk tie. His hair was impeccably styled, and he wore a pair of wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an air of trustworthy intellectualism. From where I sat, he literally towered over the room, looking down at me with an arrogant, barely concealed smirk. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth with a voice so smooth and confident it made my stomach turn. Brad played the jury with the masterful precision of a seasoned predator. He knew exactly how to use his polished appearance and his status to command absolute trust from the 12 strangers sitting in the box. He leaned into the microphone and spun a tale of pure, complete fiction. He testified that he and his pregnant wife were simply leaving a late-night dinner when I aggressively intercepted them. He claimed I was acting highly erratic and forced them into my vehicle under the pretense of discussing a family emergency. I took perfectly timed pauses, taking off his glasses to pinch the bridge of his nose, pretending to be overcome with the traumatic memory of the crash. He swore under oath that he had absolutely no idea the suitcases in the trunk were filled with illegal narcotics and laundered cash. He painted himself as a heroic, protective husband who threw his own body over his pregnant wife when I recklessly drove the car straight into the storefront. He claimed he was desperately trying to stop me from fleeing the scene when the police arrived. The jury hung on his every single word. They looked at his expensive suit, his handsome face, and his tearful declarations of protecting his unborn child, and they swallowed the lie completely whole. They saw a respectable white financial advisor trapped in a nightmare created by a deeply disturbed sister-in-law. Brad glanced down at me from his elevated perch, and for a fraction of a second his mask slipped. He gave me a cold, dead-eyed look of absolute triumph. He knew he had won. I knew the system was built to protect men exactly like him and to easily discard women like me. The prosecution then called my mother to the stand. Valerie walked up the center aisle wearing a tasteful conservative black dress. She clutched a lace handkerchief in her trembling hands. If Brad was the hero of this fabricated tragedy, my mother was the ultimate tragic victim. She took her seat and immediately began to weep soft, dignified tears that completely shattered any remaining doubt in the courtroom. She testified about the heavy burden of raising a troubled, cynical daughter. She told the court that they had provided me with every possible advantage, every educational opportunity, and endless amounts of love, but I continually rejected their help. She described me as a deeply bitter woman who harbored a terrifying, dangerous jealousy toward my younger sister Chloe. She lied through her teeth, stating she had caught me stealing from the family before and that she had long suspected I was involved with a dangerous criminal element. Every word out of her mouth was a calculated poisoned dagger aimed directly at my character. I pray every single night that this prison sentence will finally get Maya the intensive psychological help she so desperately refuses to seek. Valerie sobbed, gripping the edges of the witness stand. My husband and I are completely heartbroken, but we must protect our pregnant daughter and our innocent son-in-law from this destructive violence. We have to let the justice system do what we failed to do as parents. It was an Oscar-worthy performance. The jury members looked at her with profound sympathy. Some of them actually glared at me with open disgust. They saw a wealthy, respectable black family doing the agonizing but morally correct thing by holding their criminal daughter accountable. Throughout this entire grotesque theater production, my father Marcus sat in the very front row of the gallery. He did not need to take the witness stand. His presence alone was the anchor holding this massive conspiracy together. He sat with his arms crossed over his chest, his posture rigid and authoritative. He wore his power like a heavy dark cloak. Several times during the hearing, I saw the presiding judge, who was undoubtedly an old colleague of his offer Marcus, small subtle nods of solidarity. Marcus watched the legal slaughter of his eldest daughter with eyes as cold and empty as a frozen lake. He did not flinch when Brad lied. He did not show a single ounce of remorse when Valerie wept her fake tears. He was the brilliant, ruthless architect of this entire farce, and he was watching his grand design execute flawlessly. He was preserving his precious family legacy, preserving his country club status, and preserving the illusion of his perfect life by actively burying me alive. The sheer vertical space of the courtroom seemed to press down heavily on my shoulders, forcing me deeper into my chair. The architecture of the room itself was designed to make the defendant feel incredibly small and entirely powerless. I sat there absorbing the crushing weight of their combined betrayal. Richard Sterling sat next to me, shuffling his meaningless legal pads, occasionally leaning over to remind me to keep my eyes fixed firmly on the table. I was ensuring I played the role of the defeated broken criminal to the very end. But as I sat under the oppressive high angle of the judge's bench and the towering arrogance of my family, I was not breaking. The intense burning fury inside my chest had completely solidified into a cold, unbreakable diamond. I listened to their perjured testimonies. I memorized the exact cadence of Brad's lies. I memorized the specific pitch of my mother's fake sobs. I locked away the image of my father's cold, indifferent stare. They thought they were burying a deeply flawed, helpless victim who would spend the next year weeping in a concrete cell. They thought this courtroom was the final chapter of my story. They had absolutely no idea that they were simply giving me the exact isolation and the absolute clarity I needed to meticulously engineer their total financial and social ruin. The gavel came down with a loud, definitive crack, sealing my unjust fate. But as I was led out of the courtroom in heavy steel shackles, I kept my head held high. I was walking into the dark, but I was taking the keys to their destruction right in with me. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp cracking noise that echoed through the cavernous courtroom. The presiding judge adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at me from his elevated bench. His expression was a mixture of manufactured pity and stern legal authority. He began to read the final sentencing order, and every single word he spoke was designed to systematically dismantle the life I had spent over a decade building. He sentenced me to 12 months in a federal minimum security correctional facility, but the prison time was only the beginning of the execution. The judge moved on to the secondary penalties, and this was where my father's true sinister brilliance revealed itself. The court formally revoked all of my professional financial licenses. I was a self-made private equity manager, and my entire career was built on absolute trust and a flawless regulatory record. In less than 3 minutes, the judge completely obliterated my professional standing. He legally barred me from operating any licensed financial institution, holding fiduciary responsibility, or trading on behalf of clients. The judge looked at me with deep disappointment and stated that my actions had brought immense shame to a highly respected Atlanta family. He lectured me on the dangers of greed and reckless behavior, completely oblivious to the fact that the real criminals were sitting comfortably in the front row of his own gallery. He officially declared me a convicted felon. My pristine credit score, my hard-earned business reputation, and my untarnished public identity were instantly reduced to absolute ash. As the judge's final words settled over the silent room, the world around me seemed to slow down to a grueling, heavy crawl. The ambient noises of the courtroom, the scratching of the court reporter's pen, the soft murmurs of the jury, the shifting of wooden benches, all faded into a dull, distant hum. I could feel the invisible camera of reality pushing slowly inward, focusing entirely on my face. My defense attorney, Richard Sterling, placed a firm warning hand on my forearm, expecting me to break down. My mother, Valerie, leaned forward in her seat, holding a perfectly folded tissue to her dry eyes, waiting for my inevitable collapse. They all wanted the final satisfying victory of watching me shatter into a million pieces. They wanted the validation of my tears to wash away their own sickening guilt. But the tears never came. Instead of breaking my face, settled into a mask of pure cold stone. The overwhelming shock and the suffocating despair that had gripped me since the night of the crash entirely evaporated. In their place, a terrifying, lethal calm washed over my brain. Every single muscle in my body relaxed. I did not look at the floor in shame. I did not slump my shoulders in defeat. I sat perfectly straight, letting the cold steel of the handcuffs rest heavily on the defense table. The absolute worst thing they could possibly do to me had already been done. They had stripped away my freedom and my name, but they had also completely stripped away my familial obligations. By discarding me, they had severed the only chains that ever held me back. I was no longer the responsible older sister or the obedient daughter. I was a financial predator who had just been handed a massive grudge and absolutely nothing left to lose. The judge looked down at me one last time before closing his thick leather binder. He asked the standard procedural question, inquiring if the defendant had anything to say before being remanded to the custody of the federal marshals. Richard Sterling's fingers dug painfully into my sleeve. He hissed under his breath, ordering me to stay perfectly quiet and accept the sentence without causing a scene. I completely ignored him. The heavy chains linking my wrist to my waist rattled loudly in the dead silent room as I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. The bailiff took a cautious step forward, resting his hand on his utility belt, but I did not make any sudden movements. I stood tall, smoothing the front of my drab uniform with my bound hands. I did not look at the judge or the jury. I turned my body slowly and deliberately to face the gallery, directly locking eyes with the four people who had orchestrated my total destruction. I looked at Brad first. His arrogant intellectual facade remained perfectly in place, but I saw the tiny, rapid pulse of a vein in his neck. I was a coward hiding behind a stolen reputation. I looked at my mother, Valerie, who quickly dabbed at her dry eyes, attempting to maintain her tragic maternal performance for the surrounding spectators. I looked at my father, Marcus, who stared back at me with the cold, unyielding arrogance of a man who firmly believed he was entirely untouchable. Finally, I looked at Chloe. My beautiful, pregnant golden child sister sat comfortably between our parents, wearing a designer dress funded by the very dirty money that was currently sending me to a concrete cell. I did not scream. I did not cry or throw wild accusations. I let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of surrender. It was the smile of a woman who had just figured out exactly how to win the long game. The absolute sheer confidence of my expression caused a visible ripple of deep discomfort to pass through my parents. I held Chloe's gaze, allowing my voice to carry clearly and sharply across the silent mahogany room. "One day your masks will fall." The words were spoken with a quiet, deadly precision. They were not a frantic threat. They were a blood oath. I delivered the promise with such absolute, unwavering certainty that the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I saw my father's jaw clench tightly. I saw the sudden flash of genuine primal fear completely shatter the polished composure in Brad's eyes. They had expected a weeping, broken victim, but instead they were staring at a highly calculating adversary who had just accepted a declaration of total war. But Chloe, being the utterly spoiled and terribly naive child she had always been, simply leaned back against the hard wooden bench and let out a soft, dismissive scoff. She tilted her chin upward and offered me a small, triumphant smirk. She truly believed she had won. She believed the heavy iron doors of a federal prison would magically swallow me whole and permanently erase me from their perfect, affluent reality. She thought my chilling promise was just the pathetic, empty parting shot of a completely defeated woman. The judge struck his gavel one final time, impatiently ordering the bailiffs to take me into custody. A heavy hand gripped my upper arm, firmly guiding me away from the defense table and toward the heavy side door that led to the holding cells. I did not look back as I walked down the aisle. The heavy clanking of my chains echoed with every single step, counting down the exact moments until my inevitable return. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me, sealing me away from the bright courtroom and plunging me into the harsh fluorescent reality of the correctional system. I was stripped of my personal belongings, processed through a humiliating series of security checks, and loaded onto a heavily armored transport bus bound for the federal facility. I stared out the wire mesh window as the sleek glass towers of downtown Atlanta slowly faded into the distance. My financial accounts were frozen. My luxury penthouse was empty. My pristine reputation was entirely dead. But as the transport bus merged onto the highway, moving me toward a 12-month sentence, I did not feel an ounce of despair. My brain was already operating at maximum capacity, crunching numbers, analyzing legal loopholes, and mapping out complex financial structures. They thought sending a self-made private equity manager to a federal prison would break her spirit. They completely forgot that prison is simply a networking hub for some of the most ruthless accountants and disgraced corporate lawyers in the country. I had precisely 365 days to prepare. It was not a prison sentence anymore. It was a meticulously scheduled countdown to their absolute financial and social annihilation. I leaned my head against the cold, vibrating glass of the window and let my cold smile return. The game had just begun. The heavy rubber soles of my state-issued boots slapped against the polished concrete floor in a rhythmic, echoing cadence. The sound followed me down the long, sterile corridor of the Federal Correctional Facility, moving in perfect synchronization with my racing heart. The prison was not a violent maximum security fortress, but it was still an unforgiving cage. It was a sprawling gray warehouse deliberately designed to strip away your identity, your dignity, and your connection to the outside world. I marched past the row of narrow cinderblock cells, keeping my eyes locked straight ahead, completely ignoring the hollow stares of the other inmates. I was walking toward the communal phone bank. It was my first eligible day to make an outside call. I picked up the heavy plastic receiver, pressing it tightly against my ear to block out the chaotic noise of the recreation room. I dialed the familiar number of my parents' lavish Atlanta estate. The automated system prompted me to state my name and wait for the recipient to accept the charges. I stood there holding my breath, staring at a peeling patch of paint on the wall. I listened to the dial tone ring once, then twice, then a third time. The line suddenly clicked, sending a sharp automated voice directly into my ear, informing me that the call had been declined. I did not flinch. I slowly placed the receiver back onto the hook. I told myself it was just a scheduling conflict. I convinced myself that my mother Valerie was simply busy hosting one of her extravagant afternoon charity luncheons, and my father Marcus was tied up in an important legal consultation. I rationalized their silence with the exact same pathetic excuses I had used my entire life. I retreated to my narrow bunk and stared at the concrete ceiling, forcing down the bitter lump forming in my throat. Thanksgiving arrived a few weeks later, bringing a biting damp chill that seeped right through the poorly insulated walls of the prison. The facility served dry turkey and watery mashed potatoes on compartmentalized plastic trays. As I sat in the loud, crowded cafeteria pushing the tasteless food around with a plastic spork, my mind involuntarily drifted back to Atlanta. I knew exactly what was happening at my parents' house. The massive mahogany dining table would be covered in fine crystal and imported linens. Chloe would be wearing a new designer dress, rubbing her supposedly pregnant belly for the cameras, while Brad poured expensive champagne and charmed their wealthy guests. They were giving thanks for their perfect, untouched reputation, completely ignoring the fact that they had sacrificed my freedom to maintain it. I walked back to the phone bank that evening. The line was long, filled with women crying and laughing as they spoke to their families. When my turn finally came, I dialed Chloe's cell phone. I wanted to hear her voice. I wanted to know if the crushing guilt of sending her own sister to prison had finally pierced through her thick armor of narcissism. The call went straight to voicemail. Her cheerful recorded greeting echoed in my ear, asking me to leave a message. I hung up without saying a word. Then came Christmas, the absolute cruelest time of the year to be locked inside a cage. The guards had strung up cheap plastic garlands in the main visitation hall, attempting to manufacture a festive atmosphere that only made the sterile environment feel infinitely more depressing. I sat in a hard plastic chair near the back of the room, watching the heavy reinforced double doors swing open. Inmates rushed forward to embrace their crying mothers, their husbands, and their excited children. The room was filled with the overwhelming warmth of familial love and desperate reunions. I sat there for 2 straight hours. I watched the door until my eyes burned. Every time a new visitor walked through the metal detector, my heart betrayed my logic and skipped a hopeful beat. But no one stepped forward to call my name. The guard standing near my section looked down at me with a soft expression of profound pity. That look of pity felt like a physical slap to the face. I did not want sympathy. I wanted my family. I wanted my father to walk through those doors, demand to speak to the warden, and tell me this was all a terrible mistake. When visiting hours officially ended, the guard gently tapped my shoulder, telling me it was time to head back to the cell block. My visitor log remained a completely blank, pristine sheet of paper. No one had signed in. No one had even attempted to clear the background check required for visitation. My family had not just forgotten me in the holiday rush. They had deliberately, actively chosen to erase me from their existence. They were treating my prison sentence like a minor social embarrassment that could be easily swept under their expensive Persian rugs. March marked my 33rd birthday. There was no cake, no celebration, and absolutely no acknowledgement of the day. I spent the morning working my assigned shift in the prison laundry room, loading heavy damp sheets into massive industrial dryers. The physical labor was exhausting, but it kept my mind sharply focused. During my 30-minute break, I walked to the phone bank one final time. It was a test, a final definitive experiment to completely kill the last remaining shred of the naive, dutiful daughter inside my soul. I dialed my father's private cell phone number. The number he only gave to family and his most trusted political allies. The phone did not ring. A harsh electronic tone blared through the speaker, followed by a robotic message stating that the number you have reached has been disconnected or is no longer in service. I slowly lowered the phone. He had changed his number. My father, a man who had utilized the same phone number for over a decade, had actively changed his contact information to ensure I could never reach him from behind these walls. He had completely severed the final digital thread tying me to my bloodline. That disconnected tone was the absolute best birthday gift he could have ever given me. Standing in that narrow, dimly lit hallway, staring at the battered metal payphone, I felt a massive, heavy chain completely snap and fall away from my chest. The agonizing, desperate craving for their love and their validation instantly died. The crushing weight of lifelong rejection evaporated into thin air. The woman who had spent 32 years desperately trying to earn a seat at their toxic table ceased to exist. I walked away from the phone bank and I never looked back. I never dialed their numbers again. I never checked the visitor log. I took all the raw, agonizing pain of their absolute betrayal and I forged it into a weapon of cold, unbreakable steel. The prison environment was no longer a place of punishment. It became my personal training ground. I redirected every single ounce of my mental energy toward absolute total preparation. I spent every free hour inside the prison library. While other inmates read romance novels or watched daytime television, I devoured complex corporate tax law textbooks. I studied recent precedents in corporate restructuring, forensic accounting, and federal asset forfeiture. I pored over thick volumes of real estate law, specifically focusing on mortgage defaults and aggressive foreclosure tactics in the state of Georgia. I realized that being surrounded by convicted white-collar criminals was actually a massive strategic advantage. I sat in the recreation yard and quietly listened to disgraced hedge fund managers and former corporate lawyers complain about the exact loopholes that had led to their downfall. I absorbed their mistakes. I mapped out their failed financial structures, and I learned exactly how to exploit the blind spots of the federal banking system. I was meticulously sharpening my mind, turning my brain into a highly calibrated instrument of financial destruction. I stopped looking in the mirror. I did not care about the dark circles under my eyes or the harsh toll the prison environment was taking on my physical appearance. The glamorous private equity manager in the silk designer suits was gone. I was stripping myself down to the absolute core, building an impenetrable psychological fortress. I realized that my parents and Chloe operated entirely on emotion, on panic, on greed, and on their desperate need for public validation. I would not operate on any of those things. I would operate on cold, hard, undeniable mathematics. I began using my limited computer access time to quietly, legally monitor the public financial markets through the prison's restricted educational portal. I could not execute trades, but I could watch the trends. I could see the exact warning signs indicating that the volatile cryptocurrency market Brad was heavily manipulating was beginning to show massive structural cracks. I knew that without my legitimate financial guidance, and without the $50,000 loan I had refused to give him, Brad was flying completely blind. He was inevitably going to make a catastrophic, desperate mistake. He was going to drain Marcus and Valerie completely dry to cover his mounting illegal debts. My 12-month sentence was no longer a tragedy. It was a perfectly timed waiting period. I just needed to let them confidently dig their own massive grave while I quietly mapped out the exact coordinates to bury them in it. The absolute silence from my family was not a punishment anymore. It was the sound of my enemies completely dropping their guard. I paced the narrow concrete floor of my cell every night, visualizing the exact moment I would step back out into the Atlanta rain. The weakness was entirely gone. The empathy was dead. The empty visitor list was the absolute best thing that could have ever happened to me, because it proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that when the time finally came to pull the trigger and destroy their entire world, I would not feel a single ounce of regret. The suffocating humidity of the facility laundry room was a physical weight pressing down on my lungs. The air tasted permanently of cheap bleach and hot rust. The deafening rhythmic thud of a dozen industrial washing machines made it impossible to hear anything beyond a few feet. It was the absolute perfect place to hide in plain sight. I was violently shaking out a heavy, damp canvas laundry bag when I felt the unmistakable weight of someone watching me. I glanced over my shoulder and locked eyes with her. Her name was Elena. She was a quiet, sharply observant woman in her late 50s with iron gray hair pulled into a tight, severe bun. Unlike the other inmates who carried themselves with either volatile aggression or defeated slumps, Elena moved with military precision. She had been assigned to the folding station directly behind my washing row. For weeks we had worked back to back without exchanging a single word. She just watched me. She watched me read thick legal volumes during my strictly timed breaks. She watched me write tiny, complex mathematical equations on the margins of my required reading books, and then carefully tear those margins into microscopic pieces and flush them away. "You are applying the corporate restructuring clauses completely wrong." Her voice was a low, raspy whisper that cut straight through the roar of the massive dryers. I froze, keeping my hands perfectly still inside the canvas bag. I did not turn around. I simply tilted my head back slightly, listening over my shoulder. "If you are trying to force a hostile takeover of an over-leveraged asset using a proxy entity, you need to look at the offshore tax havens in the Cayman network, not domestic bankruptcy laws." Elena continued, her hands moving robotically as she folded a stack of gray prison uniforms. "Domestic laws require public disclosure periods. If you want to absolutely gut someone without them seeing the knife until they are already bleeding out, you have to route the debt acquisition through a blind trust." I slowly turned around, clutching a damp uniform in my hands. I stared at this unassuming older woman, my mind racing. How on earth did a federal inmate serving time in a minimum security facility know the intricate, ruthless mechanics of shadow banking and hostile corporate acquisitions? Elena did not stop folding. She did not even look up at me. She just kept her eyes on the rough fabric. 20 years as a senior forensic accountant for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She stated the fact with a bitter clinical detachment. "I spent 2 decades tracking down the exact kind of dirty money your fake investment guru brother-in-law is currently laundering. I know how the cartels hide it. I know how the politicians wash it. And I know exactly how the federal government seizes it." I stepped closer to her station, pretending to reach for a stack of clean towels. "Why are you in here?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the mechanical hum of the room. Because I traced the wrong bank account to the wrong highly connected state senator. Elena replied, her jaw clenching tightly. I found $5 million of embezzled campaign funds. Instead of promoting me, my corrupt unit chief framed me for evidence tampering and obstruction of justice. They stripped my pension, ruined my name, and buried me in here to keep me quiet. I looked at the harsh lines around her mouth and the cold, dead exhaustion in her eyes. She was another highly capable woman who had been completely chewed up and spat out by powerful men desperate to protect their own fabricated reputations. We were two sides of the exact same broken coin. I know who you are, Maya, Elena whispered, tossing a folded shirt into a plastic bin. I read the financial papers. I know about your private equity firm. You have the aggressive macroeconomic vision to destroy a company, but you do not have the microscopic forensic skills to trace hidden cryptocurrency ledgers and offshore shell accounts. You need to map out exactly where your brother-in-law owes money and who he owes it to. You need to track his digital footprint so you can completely collapse his fragile house of cards. You cannot do that alone from inside a concrete box. I leaned against the vibrating metal of the washing machine, staring at the back of her gray uniform. What do you want, Elena? I want my life back. She turned her head slightly, fixing me with a piercing, desperate gaze. I need high-powered external legal representation to appeal my conviction, and I need absolute financial security when I get out of here. I have 0 assets left. They took everything. If I give you the exact blueprint to financially obliterate your toxic family and expose the man who framed you, I want a guaranteed position at your firm and a fully funded legal defense team waiting for me on the outside. It was the ultimate transaction, a flawless, calculated exchange of highly specialized assets. I had the untouched, untraceable personal wealth safely locked away in external accounts that my family knew absolutely nothing about. I had the aggressive corporate power waiting for me on the outside. Elena had the exact federal tracking knowledge I desperately needed right now to map out Brad's entire illegal network and drag my father's pristine reputation down into the mud with it. We have a deal, I whispered. From that moment forward, the prison laundry room transformed into our private clandestine war room. We operated with absolute ruthless efficiency. We never sat together in the cafeteria. We never spoke in the recreation yard. We only communicated while standing back to back over the roaring industrial machines hidden by the thick clouds of chemical steam. Elena became my grandmaster. Over the deafening sound of the tumbling dryers, she taught me the exact methodology the FBI uses to track laundered cryptocurrency through decentralized digital exchanges. She explained how fraudulent investment advisors, like Brad, typically structure their shell companies to create the illusion of massive liquidity while actually running a desperate Ponzi scheme. I would memorize the complex routing structures she whispered to me. When I returned to my cell at night, I would map out Brad's entire psychological and financial profile based on the years I spent watching him manipulate my parents. I knew his fatal flaw was his massive, unchecked ego. He always needed to look like the smartest man in the room, which meant he was definitely over-leveraging my father's real estate assets to cover his illegal gambling and his failing crypto bets. We mapped out a devastatingly brilliant strategy, using nothing but stolen napkins and the tiny stubs of graphite pencils. Elena showed me exactly how to identify the specific banking institutions Brad would be forced to use once his illegal cash flow inevitably dried up. She taught me how to legally monitor public foreclosure filings and distressed debt markets without triggering any federal watch lists. More importantly, she taught me how to use my external wealth to set up a completely anonymous blind trust through a series of offshore proxies. We were constructing a massive, invisible financial spiderweb. When Brad inevitably defaulted on his loans and the bank moved to foreclose on my father's ancestral mansion, my anonymous company would be waiting in the shadows to purchase that specific debt for pennies on the dollar. It was absolute poetic justice. My father had used his legal connections to lock me in a cage. I was going to use my financial brilliance to legally steal the roof right over his head. We spent months refining the trap. Elena broke down the exact federal statutes Brad was violating, ensuring that when I finally dropped the evidence on the authorities, it would result in a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years. There would be no plea deals for him. There would be no high-priced lawyers saving his skin. We were going to hand the FBI a perfectly wrapped, airtight indictment. Every single day, the steamy laundry room became a masterclass in forensic destruction. I absorbed Elena's knowledge like a sponge. The lingering anger and the bitter sting of my family's betrayal were completely replaced by the cold, thrilling anticipation of the strike. They thought I was spending my days rotting away in sorrow folding cheap prison sheets. They had no idea I was standing shoulder to shoulder with a federal financial sniper, meticulously writing the exact coordinates for an airstrike that would burn their entire elite empire to the ground. The execution of our strategy required an unbreakable line of communication to the outside world. Every single phone call made from within the federal correctional facility was heavily monitored, recorded, and logged by the Bureau of Prisons. I was granted exactly 15 minutes of phone time a day. I would stand in the loud, chaotic recreation yard, gripping the heavy metal receiver, while dozens of desperate women screamed, cried, and begged their families for commissary money right next to me. I did not waste a single second on tears or self-pity. I used my 15 minutes to meticulously orchestrate a hostile financial takeover. I dialed a private secure line located in a glass-walled high-rise office in downtown Atlanta. The man who picked up the phone on the first ring was Elias Thorne. Elias was a ruthless, highly discreet corporate attorney who specialized in aggressive wealth management and shadow acquisitions. I had secretly retained his firm 3 years ago when I first realized my family's toxic obsession with maintaining their elite social image would eventually become a massive, volatile liability. They thought I was just a cynical daughter who hoarded her private equity bonuses. They had absolutely no idea that I had proactively created an impenetrable financial ghost. I had locked away over $5 million in a highly complex blind trust named Obsidian Holdings. The trust was layered through a labyrinth of shell companies registered in Delaware and routed through offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. When the judge ordered my domestic bank accounts frozen and my professional licenses revoked during my sentencing, Obsidian Holdings remained completely untouched. It was a bulletproof financial bunker, and Elias was the only person on the outside who held the launch codes. "Elias, it is Maya," I spoke quietly, keeping my back turned to the prison yard cameras. "Good morning, Maya." Elias replied, his voice smooth and entirely unfazed by the automated prison warning playing over the line. "I assume you are calling to activate the Obsidian Protocol." "Exactly." I kept my eyes fixed on the razor wire, completely ignoring the freezing wind biting through my thin uniform. "We need to run a deep forensic audit on an unregistered cryptocurrency portfolio. I need you to completely dismantle the domestic financial footprint of Brad Sterling. Look for severely over-leveraged assets. I am operating under the assumption that he has a massive critical liquidity crisis." I could not give Elias explicit instructions about money laundering or federal crimes over a recorded line. I had to speak in the sterile coded language of corporate risk assessment. But Elias was a predator in a tailored suit. He knew exactly how to read between the lines. "Consider it done," he stated simply. For the next 3 months, my life became a high-speed, alternating montage of absolute physical exhaustion and thrilling intellectual warfare. During the day, I was scrubbing industrial pots in the prison cafeteria or folding endless stacks of gray uniforms in the suffocating laundry room. While the harsh chemicals burned my hands, Elena would stand behind me whispering a rapid-fire stream of specific digital routing numbers and known cartel shell company, aliases she had memorized during her 20 years at the FBI. I would lock those complex alphanumeric sequences into my brain, repeating them like a dark mantra until I could secure my 15 minutes at the payphone. I would feed those exact sequences to Elias. He and his shadow team of forensic accountants would immediately deploy aggressive digital probes, plunging deep into the unregulated distressed debt markets and public property ledgers. They were hunting for Brad's specific financial signature. The contrast between my two realities was incredibly jarring. I was sitting on a hard concrete bunk eating stale bread out of a plastic wrapper, while my unseen army of Ivy League lawyers sat in leather chairs tracking millions of dollars across international borders on my behalf. I was physically locked in a cage, but intellectually I was freely roaming the global financial markets, tightening a lethal invisible noose around my family's neck. Brad believed he was an absolute genius for using decentralized cryptocurrency mixers to wash his dirty money. But Elena was right. Brad was arrogant, and arrogance always breeds catastrophic laziness. Elias discovered that Brad had reused the exact same digital wallets to transfer funds directly into his personal checking accounts. He was using the same contaminated money pool to pay off his dangerous suppliers and to fund Chloe's lavish designer shopping sprees. He was leaving a massive glowing digital trail of breadcrumbs leading straight to his front door. But the most devastating discovery came during the second week of November. I was standing in the freezing rain waiting for my turn at the phone bank when Elias finally delivered the killing blow. "Maya, we found the structural weakness," Elias said the moment I picked up the receiver. His usually calm voice carried a sharp edge of genuine disbelief. "Your brother-in-law did not just lose his client's money in the crypto crash, he completely wiped out his own liquidity. To cover his massive margin calls and stop his creditors from breaking his legs, he needed a rapid injection of $5 million in pure, untraceable cash." "Where did he get it?" I asked, my grip tightening on the plastic phone. "I went to your father," Elias replied. The world around me seemed to completely stop. Marcus, my rigid image-obsessed father who had sacrificed me to the justice system to protect his perfect reputation, had secretly funded a federal criminal. Elias continued reading the financial documents his team had unearthed. Marcus could not stand the thought of his golden son-in-law going bankrupt and bringing a massive public scandal to their doorstep. So Marcus secretly took out a highly aggressive predatory equity loan. He leveraged the family's ancestral Buckhead mansion, the estate that has been in your family for 3 generations. He put the entire property up as collateral to secure $5 million in liquid cash, and he handed every single cent directly to Brad. A dark, chilling laugh escaped my lips. My father had put his entire legacy on the roulette table to save a white con artist. He had risked the roof over his own wife's head to maintain the illusion of black excellence. "There is more," Elias added. "Marcus could not sign the secondary guarantor documents alone due to his age and risk profile. He needed a secondary signature to secure the predatory interest rate. Chloe co-signed the loan. My perfect golden sister." Chloe knew exactly how close they were to total financial ruin. She actively participated in the financial suicide of our parents, just to keep up the appearance of her flawless, wealthy marriage. They were all in on it together. They had built a massive, fragile house of cards, and it was currently soaking in gasoline. "What is the status of the loan, Elias?" I demanded, my mind calculating the final strike. "It is completely toxic," Elias confirmed. "Brad blew the $5 million trying to chase his losses in a crashing market. He is entirely broke. The loan has a massive balloon payment coming due in exactly 4 months. They have already missed 2 preliminary interest payments. The private lending group that holds the mortgage is preparing to declare a formal default. They are quietly shopping the debt on the secondary distressed market, trying to offload it before the house goes into public foreclosure. 4 months. The balloon payment was going to detonate right around the exact same time I was scheduled to be released from this facility. The timing was so perfectly orchestrated it felt like divine intervention. My family was actively drowning, fighting for their last breath of air, while desperately pretending they were still sitting comfortably on their luxury yacht. "Elias," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, commanding whisper, "I want you to execute a full acquisition through Obsidian Holdings. I do not just want to buy their debt. I want to become the bank." "Understood," Elias replied, the sound of his keyboard clacking rapidly in the background. "We will purchase the paper through a blind proxy. They will have absolutely no idea who actually holds the deed to their home until you are standing in their living room. Buy it all, Elias." I ordered, my eyes scanning the high concrete walls that had held me captive for months. Buy the mortgage on the Buckhead mansion. Buy the debt on Chloe's luxury vehicles. Buy every single outstanding credit line Brad has left to his name. I want Obsidian Holdings to own the very ground they walk on. I hung up the phone and walked slowly back to my cell block. The heavy metal doors clanked shut behind me, but I did not feel trapped anymore. I lay down on my thin mattress and stared up at the dark ceiling. The crushing weight of their betrayal, the stinging memory of my father's slap, the fake tears my mother cried in the courtroom, all of it was completely gone. I had successfully weaponized my isolation. I had officially transformed my prison sentence into a corporate slaughterhouse. I closed my eyes and let a genuine peaceful smile spread across my face. They had 12 months to enjoy their stolen freedom and their fake perfect lives. They had 12 months to completely forget about the daughter they had buried alive. But the clock was ticking down to zero, and the monster they had created in the dark was finally getting ready to come home. The heavy manila envelope felt surprisingly heavy in my hands. Stamped with the bold red letters indicating privileged attorney-client communication, it bypassed the standard prison mail inspection, completely unopened. I sat on the edge of my thin mattress, the harsh fluorescent light buzzing overhead, and broke the wax seal. Elias had delivered the final comprehensive autopsy report of my family's entire financial existence. I pulled out the thick stack of heavily redacted bank statements, property ledgers, and wire transfer logs. As I began to read the meticulously organized pages, the narrow concrete walls of my cell seemed to slowly pull back, expanding into a vast theater of absolute destruction. A slow, chilling smirk crept across my face, locking into place. The truth was not just bad. It was an absolute masterpiece of grotesque, catastrophic ruin. Brad had not merely made a few poor investments. He was a financial parasite who had successfully hollowed out the host from the inside out, and my parents had willingly handed him the scalpel. The documents detailed exactly how the $5 million loan against the ancestral Buckhead mansion was just the tip of the iceberg. Brad had taken that massive injection of cash and dumped it directly into a decentralized cryptocurrency platform that was later exposed as a massive federal Ponzi scheme. I did not lose the money in a volatile market. He handed it directly to bigger, smarter criminals. But the absolute true horror, the deeply sickening reality that made my smirk widen into a grin of pure cynical disbelief, was watching how my family reacted to the bleeding. When the $5 million vanished, Brad did not confess. Instead, he panicked and started systematically draining every single drop of generational wealth my family possessed to cover the exorbitant monthly interest payments on the toxic loan. And he did it with Chloe's explicit active cooperation. The financial trails were undeniable. I stared at wire transfers authorized by my sister moving hundreds of thousands of dollars from my parents' emergency reserve accounts directly into Brad's failing LLCs. Chloe knew exactly what was happening. She knew her husband was a complete fraud running a massive illegal scam. She knew the money he was bleeding from our father was actively disappearing into a digital black hole. But rather than stop him, rather than protect the parents who had worshipped the ground she walked on, she doubled down. She helped him forge Marcus's signature on secondary line of credit applications. She willingly liquidated my mother's untouchable trust fund just to keep the lights on in their fake perfect life. My mother, Valerie, the ultimate Atlanta socialite, was currently living a complete and utter lie. The financial dossier revealed that her pristine collection of diamond jewelry, the pieces she loved to flaunt at her exclusive charity, galas, had been quietly pawned and replaced with high-grade cubic zirconia months ago. The luxury vehicles parked in their sweeping circular driveway were months behind on their lease payments. My father, Marcus, a man who had spent his entire life building a flawless, towering reputation as a pillar of black excellence, had completely bankrupted his own legacy just to protect a mediocre white con artist. Brad was the ultimate Trojan horse. My parents had paraded him around their elite country clubs, showing him off as their brilliant financial savior. They had proudly elevated him above their own flesh and blood, completely oblivious to the fact that he was actively dismantling everything they had built. How was a predator who had found the absolute perfect prey, a family so blindly obsessed with maintaining their elite social image that they would literally finance their own destruction rather than admit they had made a mistake. And they had sacrificed me to buy themselves time. I looked down at the concrete floor of my cell, my state-issued boots resting on the cold gray stone. I was sitting inside a federal prison, stripped of my name, my freedom, and my career. I ate tasteless food out of plastic trays and showered in freezing water. Yet as I flipped through the final pages of the dossier, a profound, staggering irony washed over me. I was the wealthiest person in my entire bloodline. My untouched offshore accounts were generating more passive income in a single week than my father had made in his last 5 years on the judicial bench. Meanwhile, my family was sitting inside a multi-million-dollar mansion, drinking expensive wine out of crystal glasses, completely unaware that the very floorboards beneath their feet belonged entirely to me. They were the true prisoners. They were trapped in a suffocating, invisible cage of mounting debt, relentless creditors, and absolute terrifying panic. They were drowning in the shallow end of the pool, desperately pretending they were just out for a leisurely swim. The documents also revealed the absolute pathetic reality of Chloe's so-called pregnancy. The bank records showed exactly where her medical expenses were going, and it was not to an obstetrician. The charges were routed to a highly discreet cosmetic surgeon in Miami and an elite crisis management firm. The pregnancy was nothing but a brilliantly timed phantom shield designed specifically to manipulate my father into forcing my plea deal. She had never been pregnant. She had simply weaponized the concept of a child to ensure I took the fall for her husband's federal drug trafficking and money laundering charges. She had sent her own sister to rot in a concrete box to protect her access to a credit card that was already declining. I closed the thick manila folder, the satisfying thud of the paper echoing in the quiet cell. The sheer, absolute totality of their betrayal was no longer a source of pain. It was a source of immense, untouchable power. They had completely drained themselves to the very last penny. Brad had bled the family dry, leaving them with nothing but worthless equity and impending federal indictments. My father's pension was gone. My mother's inheritance was vanished. Chloe's perfect marriage was a hollow, rotting shell. I carefully slid the dossier underneath my thin mattress, hiding the execution orders from the patrolling guards. I lay back against the hard pillow and stared up at the ceiling. The 365 days were almost up. The seasons had changed, the harsh winter melting into a suffocating, humid Georgia summer. The calendar on the wall marked only a few short weeks until my official release date. They thought they had won. They truly believed they had successfully buried the one person who could see right through their immaculate facade. They were probably planning their next lavish dinner party, completely oblivious to the fact that the massive financial guillotine hanging directly over their heads had already been released. They were living on borrowed time in a borrowed house funded by borrowed money. I closed my eyes, letting the steady rhythmic hum of the prison ventilation system lull me into a state of absolute perfect calm. The anger was gone. The grief was dead. All that remained was the cold, clinical precision of a predator waiting for the exact right moment to strike. I was not just going to walk out of these prison gates and demand an apology. I was going to walk out and legally, systematically repossess every single thing they claimed to love. I was going to let them feel the exact same suffocating, helpless terror I had felt on the side of that rain-slicked road. The countdown was in its final stages. The storm was no longer gathering in the distance. I was the storm, and I was coming straight for them. The deafening mechanical shriek of the massive iron gates retracting echoed through the torrential downpour. It was a harsh, grating sound of heavy steel sliding across wet concrete. But to my ears, it was the absolute sweetest symphony I had ever heard. I stepped forward, crossing the invisible threshold that separated federal property from the free world. The freezing rain hit my face instantly, soaking through the cheap, thin fabric of the civilian clothes I had been issued just 10 minutes prior. I did not shiver. I did not pull my thin jacket tighter around my shoulders. I simply stood there, letting the icy water wash away the stale, suffocating scent of the prison facility. I looked out across the sprawling visitor parking lot. It was a vast, empty ocean of cracked gray asphalt, slick and shimmering under the heavy storm clouds. There were no welcoming committees waiting for me. There was no tearful mother rushing forward with an umbrella. There was no father standing proudly by an idling luxury sedan, ready to beg for my forgiveness, and welcome his eldest daughter back into the fold. There was no sister holding a welcome home sign. The lot was completely barren, perfectly mirroring the absolute void they had left inside my chest. A year ago, the sight of that empty parking lot might have broken my heart. The old Maya, the desperate, dutiful daughter, who constantly craved her family's validation, would have stood in the rain and cried. But that woman had died in a windowless interrogation room 12 months ago. The woman standing in the storm today felt absolutely nothing but a deep, satisfying surge of profound confirmation. Their absence was not a tragedy. It was the final necessary proof that I owed them absolutely nothing. They had successfully erased me from their perfect affluent reality, and now I was going to violently erase them from mine. Through the thick curtain of the relentless rain, a pair of piercing white LED headlights cut through the gloom. The low, aggressive rumble of a massive V8 engine vibrated through the wet pavement beneath my feet. A sleek, matte black, heavily armored SUV glided smoothly into the empty parking lot. It moved with the silent, predatory grace of a shark circling its prey. It pulled up and stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me, the dark-tinted windows completely obscuring the interior. The heavy reinforced rear door unlocked with a solid, satisfying mechanical thud and swung smoothly open. The contrast between the bleak, miserable reality of the prison yard and the interior of the vehicle was jarring. The air inside the SUV was perfectly climate-controlled, carrying the rich, sophisticated scent of expensive leather and freshly brewed espresso. Elias Thorne was sitting in the back seat. He looked absolutely immaculate in a charcoal gray bespoke suit completely untouched by the raging storm outside. He did not offer any fake sentimental greetings. He did not ask how I was holding up or inquire about the trauma of my incarceration. He understood exactly what kind of business we were in, and he knew exactly what kind of monster had just walked out of those federal gates. He simply slid over, creating space, and gestured to the plush leather seat beside him. I climbed into the expansive cabin and pulled the heavy door shut. The thick ballistic glass instantly muted the violent sound of the thunderstorm, reducing the roaring downpour to a faint, distant whisper. The immediate total silence of the armored vehicle was the first true luxury I had experienced in exactly 365 days. Elias reached into a sleek built-in console and handed me a steaming cup of black coffee, along with a brand-new encrypted smartphone. "Welcome back, Maya," he said, his voice smooth and entirely focused on the mission ahead. "The biometric security is already keyed to your fingerprints. You have absolute unrestricted access to the Obsidian Holdings mainframe. I also took the liberty of bringing a change of clothes." He pointed to a premium garment bag resting carefully on the opposite seat. Inside was a flawlessly tailored emerald green silk suit, my armor. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the scalding hot coffee, letting the bitter caffeine jumpstart my system. I set the cup down and picked up the secure device. The heavy black screen glowed to life the moment I pressed my thumb against the glass. A highly sophisticated encrypted financial interface materialized, displaying real-time data streams routed through our offshore proxies. I watched the green and red numbers shifting rapidly, mapping out the exact global flow of my hidden capital. My private equity reserves had compounded aggressively during my absence. I was holding a terrifying amount of liquid power right in the palm of my hand. "What is the exact status of the Buckhead estate?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any hesitation. Elias tapped the screen of his own tablet, pulling up a series of highly classified financial documents. The trap snapped shut at midnight. He confirmed reading the data with clinical precision. Brad officially defaulted on the balloon payment. He missed the final emergency grace period extension by a margin of 12 hours. The private lending group that holds the predatory mortgage on your father's mansion formally classified the asset as a toxic, non-performing loan. They are currently shopping the debt on the dark market, desperate to offload the risk before they have to initiate public foreclosure proceedings. Your father and Brad are currently scrambling, trying to find a bridge loan to save the property, but their credit is completely radioactive. No legitimate institution will touch them. I stared at the glowing numbers on my screen. My father, the arrogant former judge who had slapped me in the face and handed me over to the police to save his public image, was currently sitting in his sprawling mansion, completely unaware that the walls were rapidly caving in. He thought he had outsmarted the system. He thought he had successfully buried the one daughter who could expose his corrupt son-in-law. He had no idea that the executioner was currently sitting in the back of an armored SUV holding the digital launch codes to his total financial annihilation. The driver, a broad-shouldered private security specialist, shifted the heavy vehicle into gear. He glanced back at me through the rearview mirror, his expression strictly professional. "Where to, ma'am? Do you want me to take you back to your private penthouse to rest and change?" I looked out the thick tinted window, watching the tall, imposing guard towers of the federal penitentiary slowly fade into the gray mist. I thought about the narrow concrete cell, the terrible food, and the endless agonizing nights spent mapping out this exact moment. Rest was a luxury for people who had already won the war. I had not even fired the first shot yet. I reached over and unzipped the garment bag, revealing the sharp, confident lines of the emerald green suit. "No," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, cold register that echoed with absolute, undeniable authority. "The penthouse can wait. Take me straight to the financial district. Take me to Wall Street. We have a massive distressed asset acquisition to finalize before the global markets close, and I want to personally authorize the wire transfer that rips the roof right off my father's head." The driver gave a single sharp nod and merged the heavy SUV aggressively onto the rain-slicked highway. The powerful engine roared to life, propelling us forward at breakneck speed. Elias sat quietly beside me, his hands resting on his tablet, ready to execute the final devastating maneuvers of our hostile takeover. I leaned my head back against the soft leather headrest and let a slow, dark smile spread across my face. The storm raging violently outside the vehicle was absolutely nothing compared to the catastrophic financial hurricane I was about to unleash upon my family. They had given me a year in hell, and I was about to return the favor with interest. The armored SUV glided to a seamless halt in front of a towering skyscraper composed entirely of black steel and reflective glass. The storm was still raging across the city, but the moment I stepped out of the vehicle and into the private underground parking garage, the chaotic noise of the rain was instantly severed. I walked toward the secure VIP elevator, my emerald green silk suit moving with a sharp, fluid grace that I had not felt in exactly 365 days. Elias matched my pace, his stride confident and entirely professional, as he swiped a highly encrypted keycard across the biometric scanner. The heavy steel doors parted silently, and we ascended rapidly toward the absolute pinnacle of the financial district. I watched the illuminated floor numbers climb higher and higher, feeling the heavy oppressive weight of the federal penitentiary completely shed from my bones with every passing second. When the elevator doors finally opened, I stepped out into the breathtaking expanse of the Obsidian Holdings executive suite. The entire floor was a masterclass in modern corporate warfare. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a panoramic, commanding view of the storm-battered city below. The space was sleek, minimalist, and humming with the quiet, intense energy of high-level financial analysts tracking global markets. I walked slowly down the central corridor, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. The analysts and junior executives sitting behind their multi-monitor workstations did not know my actual name or my face. They only knew me as the anonymous founding partner, the phantom architect who had directed their aggressive acquisition strategies through encrypted digital channels for the past year. I moved past their desks, taking in the sheer magnitude of the empire I had cultivated entirely from the shadows of a prison laundry room. Elias guided me into the corner executive office. It was a massive, pristine room, encased entirely in soundproof glass, featuring a custom marble desk and a wall of interactive digital market displays. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the tiny vehicles navigating the flooded streets far below. I was no longer the helpless victim crying on the side of a rain-slicked road. I was the apex predator looking down at her hunting ground. Elias activated the primary display screen, transforming the entire glass wall into a glowing digital dashboard. "Welcome to your command center, Maya," he said, his voice echoing with genuine professional reverence. "As requested, I have pulled the comprehensive 12-month performance reports for the Obsidian portfolio, alongside the real-time distress metrics for your brother-in-law." I turned away from the window and focused my eyes on the data. The numbers glowing on the screen were absolutely staggering. When the judge had frozen my domestic accounts and stripped my professional licenses, my family truly believed they had left me entirely destitute. They had completely failed to account for the aggressive offshore hedging strategies I had executed right before my sentencing. Over the past year, while the traditional global markets experienced severe volatility and massive institutional pullbacks, Obsidian Holdings had capitalized on the chaos. Following the brilliant forensic strategies Elena had whispered to me over the roaring prison dryers, I had directed Elias to aggressively short the exact highly leveraged sectors where arrogant amateur investors like Brad were hiding their fake liquidity. The anonymous fund had not merely survived my incarceration, it had mutated into a financial juggernaut. My capital had compounded at a terrifying exponential rate. I was currently staring at a net liquid valuation that could easily purchase my father's entire generational legacy 100 times over without even making a noticeable dent in my portfolio. Now let us look at the other side of the board, I said, my voice cold and razor sharp. Show me Brad. Elias tapped a command on his tablet, and the massive screen shifted, pulling up a series of catastrophic red financial charts. The digital landscape of Brad's fake cryptocurrency empire was a scene of absolute total devastation. The coin he had been aggressively shilling to my parents' wealthy country club friends, the exact same unregulated token he had used to launder his dirty cartel money, had officially hit rock bottom. The collapse was sudden, brutal, and entirely irreversible. A major federal regulatory agency had just announced a sweeping investigation into the exact decentralized exchange Brad was utilizing to wash his stolen funds. Panic had immediately gripped the market, causing a massive institutional sell-off. The value of Brad's heavily manipulated portfolio plummeted to absolute zero in a matter of hours. The screen displayed real-time news feeds of furious investors filing emergency class action lawsuits and freezing whatever remaining domestic assets they could find. Brad was not just bankrupt, he was completely mathematically ruined and currently staring down the barrel of multiple federal indictments. He is completely insolvent, Maya. Elias confirmed, stating the facts with lethal clinical detachment. His primary liquidity pools evaporated at dawn. He has zero access to offshore credit, and his domestic accounts are currently being locked down by federal compliance officers. The illusion is entirely dead. He has absolutely no way to cover his outstanding margin calls, and more importantly, he has no way to satisfy the private lending group that holds the $5 million mortgage on your father's estate. I walked over to the marble desk and rested my hands on the cool, smooth surface. The image of Brad arrogant and smirking in the witness stand as he lied to a jury flashed vividly through my mind. He had worn a tailored suit and played the victim perfectly, ensuring I was sent away in chains. Right now, that exact same man was likely sitting in a cold sweat staring at his computer screens, realizing that he was about to face the exact same federal prison system he had used to bury me. And my father, I asked, my eyes narrowing as I focused on the next stage of the execution. What is the exact status of the Buckhead mansion? Elias swiped a new document onto the main screen. It was a formal legal notice stamped with the aggressive red typography of a private equity collections department. The traditional banking grace periods have officially expired, Elias explained, crossing his arms. Marcus attempted to secure an emergency bridge loan from 3 separate Tier 1 financial institutions this morning. He tried to leverage his reputation as a former judge to bypass the underwriting protocols. Every single bank rejected his application outright. Brad's financial toxicity has completely infected your father's credit profile. I let a soft, dark laugh escape my chest. Marcus had spent his entire life obsessing over his pristine reputation. He had literally sacrificed his eldest daughter to the police just to ensure his name remained untarnished in the elite circles of Atlanta society. And now the very son-in-law he had chosen to protect was the exact virus that was destroying his financial credibility. The private lending group is not waiting any longer. Elias continued, pulling up the final foreclosure timeline. They have formally initiated the default protocols. The official notice of intent to seize the property is being drafted right now. Your parents and Chloe are sitting in a multi-million-dollar estate that is currently hemorrhaging thousands of dollars in default penalties by the hour. The bank is preparing to lock the doors and throw them out into the street. I stared at the foreclosure document, my emerald silk suit reflecting sharply in the digital glass. They had stolen a year of my life. They had stripped me of my freedom, my dignity, and my trust. They thought they could simply sweep me under the rug and continue living their lavish, fraudulent lives in that massive ancestral home. They thought the game was over. Elias, I said, my voice ringing with absolute chilling authority. Execute the Obsidian Protocol immediately. Contact the private lending group. I do not care what the premium is. I want you to buy that specific debt package right now. I want Obsidian Holdings to hold the exclusive rights to that foreclosure. Elias did not hesitate. He picked up his secure phone and began dialing the direct line to the distressed asset brokers. By the time the sun sets tonight, I want to own the very floorboards my father is standing on. I commanded, my eyes locked onto the glowing red numbers marking my family's total ruin. I want to own the roof over my mother's head. I want to own the driveway where Chloe parked her luxury cars. When the bank sends the final eviction notice, I do not want it coming from a faceless corporate entity. I want it coming directly from me. The board had officially flipped. The hunted had become the apex predator. I turned back toward the panoramic window, watching the storm continue to rage across Atlanta. The rain was washing the streets clean, preparing the city for the absolute financial massacre I was about to unleash. The financial massacre began the very next morning. I stood in the center of the executive suite watching the global markets open. The glass walls of the office seemed to tilt at a sharp, jagged angle as the adrenaline coursed through my veins. Every single screen on the massive digital wall was flashing with incoming data tracking the precise movements of our offshore proxy entities. Elias was operating like a phantom, orchestrating the aggressive buyout of my family's toxic debt with surgical precision. The private lending group that held the $5 million mortgage on my father's ancestral Buckhead estate was absolutely desperate to offload the radioactive asset. When Obsidian Holdings swept in with a phantom cash offer, they did not ask a single question. They simply transferred the title, the promissory notes, and the complete foreclosure rights to our anonymous corporate shell. I watched the progress bar on Elias's monitor tick closer and closer to 100%. The room felt completely off-kilter, a dizzying rush of anticipation and raw power throwing my equilibrium totally off balance. Elias printed the final authorization document and slid it across the cool marble desk. The heavy cream-colored paper detailed the total transfer of the Buckhead mansion, the luxury vehicles, and every single outstanding credit line Brad had ever touched. It was all neatly bundled into one massive, inescapable financial trap. I picked up the heavy gold fountain pen resting on the desk. The moment the nib touched the paper, the entire world suddenly shifted back into perfect, flawless alignment. The jagged, tilted reality straightened out, snapping into absolute clarity. I signed my name with a smooth, deliberate flourish, legally authorizing the proxy buyout. It was done. I set the pen down. I was officially the sole owner of the sprawling multi-million-dollar mansion my parents were currently sleeping in. I held the deed to the very roof over their heads. I owned the driveway, the manicured lawns, and the mahogany dining table where they had proudly served me up to the justice system. They were nothing but trespassers trespassing on my absolute unyielding territory. Elias securely filed the signed document into his encrypted briefcase, but he did not close it. Instead, he pulled out a sleek silver flash drive and placed it directly in the center of the marble desk. The metallic surface gleamed under the harsh office lights. Buying their debt was only the first half of the execution, Maya. Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, serious register. Total financial ruin is devastating, but it does not clear your criminal record. If we are going to completely obliterate their pristine social standing and secure your full federal exoneration, we need undeniable, absolute proof of their perjury. I stared at the small silver drive, a cold spark of curiosity igniting in my chest. What is that? I asked. Elias picked up a remote control and seamlessly connected the flash drive to the primary wall monitor. During your trial, your father's high-priced fixer, Richard Sterling, claimed that all security cameras in the immediate vicinity of the shopping plaza were inactive on the night of the crash. He stated under oath that no visual evidence existed to contradict Brad and Chloe's testimony. Elias pressed a button on the remote, and the massive screen went completely black before flickering to life with grainy, high-definition night vision footage. Richard Sterling lied, Elias stated bluntly, and he was incredibly sloppy about it. My team of private investigators tracked down the independent contractor who was parked in a commercial delivery truck exactly 50 yards away from the storefront that night. The truck was equipped with a highly advanced motion-activated dashboard camera. Richard Sterling found the driver 2 days after your arrest and paid him $50,000 in cash to permanently erase the memory card and keep his mouth shut. My heart hammered violently against my ribs as I watched the digital timestamp on the bottom of the screen. It read exactly 2:14 in the morning on the night my life was destroyed. But the driver was smart. Elias continued, a predatory smirk playing on his lips. He took Richard's bribe, but he secretly created a backup copy of the raw, unedited footage and buried it on an encrypted server. My team finally tracked him down last night. When we offered him 10 times what Richard paid him, along with full federal immunity, he handed over the original digital file without a single second of hesitation. I locked my eyes entirely on the massive screen. The heavy freezing rain was visible in the grainy black and white footage, matching the exact horrific weather of that night. The camera angle provided a perfect unobstructed view of the shopping plaza parking lot. Suddenly, Brad's luxury black SUV roared into the frame. It was moving at a terrifying, reckless speed, hydroplaning wildly across the wet asphalt. I watched in absolute gripping silence as the heavy vehicle jumped the concrete curb and violently plowed straight through the glass storefront. The massive collision sent a shockwave of debris flying across the parking lot. The video continued to roll silently, capturing the exact immediate aftermath of the crash. The driver's side door of the mangled SUV kicked open, and a figure stumbled out into the freezing rain. It was Brad. The high-definition camera caught his face in perfect crystal-clear resolution. There was absolutely no mistaking his features. He was the one sitting behind the steering wheel. He was the one driving the vehicle. A few seconds later, the passenger door opened and Chloe climbed out looking completely panicked but entirely unharmed. I watched the digital timestamp tick forward exactly 4 minutes. Then my own car pulled into the frame. The camera perfectly documented me running frantically toward the wreckage, desperately trying to check on my sister. It captured the exact moment the trunk burst open, spilling the illegal narcotics and the laundered cash directly onto the pavement. It captured Brad falling to his knees in the mud, and Chloe immediately dropping down to help him hide the evidence. The entire false narrative they had spun in the courtroom. The heroic husband protecting his pregnant wife, the deranged sister forcing them into a high-speed crash was completely, totally, and irrefutably dismantled right before my eyes. The truth was captured in undeniable high-definition pixel by pixel. I could not breathe. I stood completely paralyzed, staring at the frozen image of my sister kneeling in the dirt, surrounded by dirty money and illegal drugs. They had actively, meticulously conspired to frame me. My father had used his legal influence to bury this exact piece of footage. He had paid a bribe to destroy the truth and protect a federal criminal just to keep his precious family reputation intact. Elias paused the video on a crystal-clear frame of Brad's panicked face. "This is the ultimate kill shot, Maya," Elias said, his voice echoing quietly in the pristine glass office. "This unedited footage proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that Brad was the driver and that he committed severe federal perjury. It proves that Chloe was entirely complicit in the cover-up and actively lied under oath. It proves that Richard Sterling committed felony evidence tampering and witness intimidation. And most importantly, it proves that your father, a highly respected former judge, orchestrated a massive criminal conspiracy to obstruct justice and falsely imprison his own daughter." I reached out and placed my hand against the cold glass of the monitor, tracing the frozen image of Brad's terrified face. The profound weight of the betrayal was no longer a heavy burden. It was an explosive, deadly weapon. I had the deed to their ancestral home. I owned every single cent of their mounting debt. And now I possessed the exact digital key to unlock my complete exoneration and send every single one of them straight to federal prison. Elias, I said, my voice dangerously low and vibrating with absolute lethal intent. I want you to prepare the formal eviction notices for the Buckhead estate. I want them drafted aggressively and I want them finalized by tonight. And the footage, Elias asked, gesturing toward the frozen screen. Do you want me to send it directly to the district attorney right now? We can have federal marshals knocking on their doors before dinner. I turned away from the screen and walked back to the marble desk, picking up the heavy gold fountain pen and sliding it gracefully into the pocket of my emerald silk suit. No, I said, a slow, dark smile pulling at the corners of my mouth. We are not going to send it to the authorities just yet. Tomorrow is my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. They are hosting the most lavish elite gala of the entire decade at the mansion. Every single major politician, wealthy investor, and high society socialite in Atlanta will be standing in their ballroom drinking expensive champagne and celebrating their flawless fake legacy. I looked Elias dead in the eyes, the cold, unyielding fire of absolute vengeance burning in my chest. I am going to deliver the eviction notice personally. I said, my voice ringing with terrifying, absolute authority. And I am going to play that footage on the main projection screen right in front of every single person they have ever tried to impress. They wanted a public spectacle when they sent me to prison. I am going to give them a public execution they will never, ever forget. Prepare the security team, Elias. We are crashing the party. The sweeping view across the grand ballroom of the Buckhead mansion revealed a masterclass in absolute delusion. Hundreds of imported crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant warm glow over the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta high society. Waitstaff in immaculate white tuxedos glided seamlessly through the crowd carrying silver trays piled high with beluga caviar and vintage champagne. The gentle, sophisticated melody of a live jazz quartet floated through the expansive room, completely masking the suffocating financial desperation that was slowly choking the hosts. Marcus and Valerie were celebrating 40 years of their pristine manufactured legacy. I watched the scene unfold through the high-definition lenses of the hidden security cameras Elias had quietly compromised earlier that afternoon. The sweeping wide angles captured a sea of designer gowns, tailored tuxedos, and influential politicians. State senators, federal judges, and corporate titans mingled freely, unaware that they were standing inside a massive financial crime scene. My mother Valerie was holding court near the grand staircase. She wore a stunning custom silk gown and a massive diamond necklace that glittered under the brilliant lights. She laughed brightly at a joke made by a prominent city councilman playing the role of the flawless matriarch to absolute perfection. She graciously accepted compliments on her beautiful home and her enduring marriage, completely ignoring the fact that the glittering stones around her neck were nothing but cheap cubic zirconia replicas. She had quietly pawned her authentic jewelry months ago to keep the lights on, but her performance tonight was entirely Oscar-worthy. My father Marcus stood proudly by her side, projecting the unshakable authority of a highly respected former judge. He clinked glasses with elite investors and powerful political allies, boasting about his extensive real estate portfolio. He smiled with the calm arrogance of a man who firmly believed he had successfully buried his only massive liability behind the thick concrete walls of a federal prison. But the sweeping camera angles also captured the terrifying cracks beginning to fracture their flawless illusion. The lens tracked smoothly across the crowded ballroom and focused tightly on Brad and Chloe. They were standing near the towering floral arrangements imported specifically for the occasion, desperately trying to maintain the image of a wildly successful power couple. Chloe wore a form-fitting designer dress, placing a gentle, perfectly manicured hand over her stomach. She was still aggressively playing the role of the expectant mother, accepting warm congratulations and expensive baby gifts from wealthy socialites. She smiled sweetly for the hired photographers, leaning into her husband's embrace. But the moment the cameras turned away, her smile instantly collapsed into a rigid mask of sheer panic. Brad was physically deteriorating right in front of the entire room. Despite the flawless tailoring of his expensive suit, he was sweating profusely. His eyes darted frantically toward the grand entrance every single time the heavy oak doors opened. He compulsively checked his luxury watch, pulling his phone from his pocket every 3 minutes, only to see the exact same terrifying zero balance on his frozen accounts. I knew the final emergency grace period on the $5 million bridge loan had officially expired at midnight. He knew the private lending group was preparing to lock the gates and throw them all out into the street. He was trapped in a room full of millionaires, carrying the horrifying secret that he could not even afford to pay the catering staff serving the very food they were eating. The hidden camera captured Brad pulling Chloe aggressively into a secluded alcove near the conservatory. The heavy velvet curtains partially shielded them from the wealthy guests. I watched the physical altercation unfold in sharp, silent high definition. Chloe's face twisted with desperate anger as she demanded to know how they were going to survive the week. She pointed a trembling finger at the lavish party outside the alcove, violently whispering that the vendors were demanding immediate payment. Brad grabbed her arms, his face pale and slick with terrified sweat. He frantically promised her that he had one final line of credit coming through, completely unaware that I owned every single financial lifeline he was desperately trying to reach. They were two drowning rats viciously clawing at each other while the ship went down. And amidst the glittering diamonds, the flowing champagne, and the hundreds of elite guests, there was one glaring absolute omission. I had been entirely, completely erased. The sweeping wide shots of the mansion revealed that the grand family portrait gallery lining the sweeping mahogany staircase had been meticulously sanitized. Every single photograph that ever contained my face had been permanently removed. My graduation pictures, my childhood portraits, the sparse holiday photos where I stood awkwardly on the edge of the frame, they were all gone. In their place were massive framed canvases of Chloe and Brad looking radiant and wealthy. I was not just a disgraced daughter serving a prison sentence. I was a phantom, a discarded secret they had successfully scrubbed from their history to protect their fragile, pristine reputation. No one in that entire crowded ballroom dared to utter a single word about the eldest daughter. The live jazz music slowly faded to a soft stop. The gentle clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal champagne glass echoed loudly across the grand ballroom. Valerie stood at the center of the sweeping staircase, beaming down at the crowd of influential guests. The room fell into a respectful, hushed silence. Marcus took the microphone, wrapping his arm affectionately around his wife's waist. He looked out over the sea of wealthy, powerful faces, his voice booming with absolute, unearned authority. He began to deliver a grand, sweeping toast about the undeniable strength of family. He spoke eloquently about weathering difficult storms, building a generational legacy, and the profound importance of maintaining integrity and honor in the face of adversity. He raised his glass to Chloe and Brad, praising them as the absolute shining future of their proud bloodline. The hypocrisy was so incredibly thick it was suffocating. They were raising a toast to a legacy built entirely on stolen money, perjury, and the deliberate false imprisonment of their own flesh and blood. The oblivious guests erupted into thunderous applause, raising their glasses high into the air to celebrate a family that was mathematically and morally bankrupt. The false harmony was reaching its absolute dizzying peak. The applause roared through the mansion, vibrating against the expensive glass windows. Marcus and Valerie drank their champagne, soaking in the adoration of their peers. Brad wiped the sweat from his forehead, forcing a final desperate smile. They thought they had successfully survived the storm. They thought the night belonged entirely to them. They were completely ready to dance the night away on the hardwood floors of a multi-million-dollar estate they no longer owned. They did not hear the silent approach of the armored convoy, pulling smoothly into their sprawling circular driveway. They did not hear the heavy tactical boots stepping onto their pristine marble porch. The stage was set perfectly, and the audience was completely captivated. The illusion was absolute. The heavy brass handles of the grand mahogany doors turned with a loud mechanical click that somehow pierced straight through the cheerful jazz music. The massive double doors swung open completely, pulling the freezing storm air directly into the suffocatingly warm ballroom. The sudden violent gust of wind extinguished the candles nearest to the entrance and sent a chilling ripple through the crowd of elite guests. The invisible camera of reality seemed to pull back slowly, steadily, parting the sea of tailored tuxedos and designer gowns. The guests instinctively stepped aside, creating a wide, unobstructed aisle straight down the center of the room. I stepped over the threshold and into the brilliant light of the crystal chandeliers. I was not wearing the drab gray uniform of a federal inmate. I was not the terrified, weeping girl who had begged for her father's mercy on the side of a rain-slicked highway. I walked into the ballroom wearing the flawless emerald green silk suit, radiating an aura of absolute terrifying power. Every single step I took against the polished marble floor echoed with the precision of a ticking clock. I did not come alone. Flanking me on my right was Elias Thorne, his bespoke suit cutting a sharp, intimidating silhouette. Behind us marched a phalanx of 3 elite corporate attorneys, holding thick leather briefcases, and 4 broad-shouldered private security specialists, who immediately fanned out to secure the perimeter of the grand foyer. We moved together like a highly synchronized corporate army, invading a defenseless territory. The jazz quartet abruptly stopped playing. A single sour note hung in the air before fading into absolute dead silence. Hundreds of heads turned in unison. The elite politicians, the wealthy investors, and the high society socialites all stopped mid-sentence. Crystal champagne glasses hovered frozen near their mouths. I could see the exact moment recognition sparked in their eyes. They knew exactly who I was. I was the disgraced eldest daughter, the convicted felon, the dark, shameful secret this family had spent an entire year trying to bury and erase from their pristine legacy. And here I was, crashing their immaculate 40-year anniversary gala with the undeniable presence of a conquering queen. I kept my chin perfectly level and my gaze locked straight ahead. I did not look at the stunning floral arrangements or the lavish ice sculptures. I walked right past the very same sweeping staircase where my childhood photos had been meticulously scrubbed from the walls. I felt the profound, intoxicating weight of my own authority. From the center of the grand staircase, Valerie's perfectly constructed mask completely shattered. The elegant, sophisticated matriarch of Atlanta society vanished in a fraction of a second. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very old under the bright lights. She gripped the wooden banister so tightly her knuckles turned a stark bone white. When she finally found her voice, it was not the cultured melodic tone she used to charm state senators. It was a shrill, panicked screech that shattered the silent ballroom. "You criminal!" Valerie shrieked, her voice vibrating with genuine terror and manufactured outrage. "How dare you show your face in this house? Who let you in here? Security! Get this absolute disgrace out of my home right now!" Her words echoed harshly against the high-vaulted ceilings. The wealthy guests exchanged shocked, uncomfortable glances, physically backing away from the escalating confrontation. Valerie lifted her heavy silk gown and marched down the remaining stairs, her face twisted into a mask of pure venom. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest, desperately trying to reclaim the narrative and assert her dominance. "You are a convicted felon!" Valerie spat spit flying from her lips as she closed the distance between us. "You have absolutely no right to be here ruining this night. You lost your right to call this place home the minute you decided to destroy your sister's life. Get out before I have you physically thrown into the street where you belong." I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I stood perfectly still, letting her toxic words wash over me like useless water. A year ago, that exact tone of voice would have paralyzed me with guilt and shame. Today it sounded like the pathetic, frantic barking of a cornered animal. I offered her a slow, chilling smile that did not reach my eyes. I looked past my mother's shaking finger and found Marcus. My father had frozen near the center of the ballroom, his glass of vintage champagne halfway to his mouth. The proud, arrogant former judge, who had just delivered a masterful speech about integrity and honor, was currently staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. He recognized the man standing next to me. Marcus was deeply embedded in the Atlanta legal world, and he knew exactly who Elias Thorne was. He knew that a ruthless shadow acquisitions attorney did not show up to a social gala unless a massive corporate slaughter was about to take place. The sheer panic finally overrode my father's shock. He reverted to the exact same brutal tactic he had used to destroy my life 12 months ago. He reached aggressively into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his smartphone. His fingers moved frantically across the screen. "I am calling 911. Marcus announced, his voice booming with forced, desperate authority as he stepped forward to join my mother. "You are trespassing on private property, Maya. You are a convicted criminal violating the peace of my home and threatening my family. I am having the police remove you in handcuffs right now. I will make sure you violate your parole and go straight back to the federal cell where you belong." He held the phone up to his ear, his eyes locked onto mine, burning with the exact same cold, unyielding hatred I remembered from the night of the crash. He was trying to assert his ultimate power. He was trying to show the entire room of influential guests that he was still the untouchable patriarch dealing swiftly and harshly with a dangerous threat. The guests murmured in shock, watching the high society patriarch actively summon the authorities to arrest his own flesh and blood. Chloe, who had been hiding near the conservatory curtains, clutched Brad's arm, desperately watching the scene unfold with wide, horrified eyes. Brad looked like he was about to physically vomit onto the polished marble floor. Marcus continued to glare at me, waiting for the fear to set in. He waited for me to beg for mercy. He waited for me to turn around and run out into the storm to avoid going back to prison. I simply tilted my head and let out a soft, dark laugh that cut effortlessly through the tension of the massive ballroom. I did not reach out to stop him. I did not raise my voice or attempt to defend myself to the staring crowd. I looked directly into my father's panicked eyes and gave him a single encouraging nod. "Call them, Marcus," I said, my voice perfectly calm, smooth, and resonating with absolute terrifying control. "Call the police. Bring the authorities straight to this exact address. In fact, I highly encourage it." My father hesitated, his finger hovering over the screen. The absolute lack of fear in my posture completely derailed his calculated plan. I took one slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance until I was standing just inches away from the people who had buried me alive. Because when the police arrive, I continued raising my voice just enough so that every single politician and investor in the room could hear me clearly. "I am going to have them escort you and your fraudulent son-in-law entirely off my property." The entire ballroom collectively gasped. The silence that followed was so absolute, so profoundly deep that you could hear the rain lashing against the glass windows outside. My mother's jaw dropped open. Marcus slowly lowered his phone, the color completely draining from his face as the impossible weight of my words finally slammed into his chest. They stared at me, completely paralyzed, trapped in the center of the lavish ballroom as the floor collapsed beneath their feet. The execution was ready to begin. I let out a sharp, cold laugh that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. Without breaking eye contact with my father, I reached back. Elias immediately placed the heavy manila folder into my outstretched hand. I slammed the thick stack of foreclosure documents and property deeds directly onto the nearest catered table, shattering a tower of champagne glasses in the process. "Call the police, Marcus," I challenged, my voice laced with absolute lethal precision. "And while you have dispatch on the line, ask them to send a moving truck to get your furniture off my property." A collective gasp ripped through the crowd of elite guests. My father stared at the document, his entire body trembling violently. The official seal of Obsidian Holdings sat right next to my legal signature, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was the sole owner of the $5 million debt. "You have exactly 24 hours to pack your bags and vacate the premises," I announced, projecting my voice so the state senators and corporate investors could hear every single devastating word. "I own this mansion. I own your vehicles. I own the very ground you are standing on. You are completely bankrupt." My mother let out a strangled, horrific cry, clutching her chest as her legs gave out. She collapsed against the banister, her flawless socialite facade entirely destroyed. But I was not finished. I gave a sharp nod to Elias. He pulled a small remote from his pocket and pressed a single button. The massive digital screens lining the ballroom that had been displaying a slideshow of my parents' fake perfect marriage suddenly went pitch black. A second later, raw high-definition night vision footage illuminated the entire room. It was the dashcam video from the night of the crash. The wealthy guests watched in stunned, horrified silence as Brad recklessly smashed his SUV into the storefront. They watched him crawl out of the driver's seat. They watched Chloe help him hide the illegal merchandise before the police arrived. The complete irrefutable proof of their perjury and criminal conspiracy was playing on a loop for all of Atlanta high society to see. Brad turned completely white. He scrambled backward desperately, trying to push his way toward the rear exit. But before he could take more than 3 steps, the heavy mahogany doors at the front of the ballroom violently burst open. A dozen federal agents wearing tactical FBI windbreakers flooded into the mansion. They did not care about the designer gowns or the expensive jazz band. They marched straight toward the alcove, grabbed Brad by the collar of his tailored suit, and slammed him against the polished marble floor. They loudly read him his rights, citing massive federal fraud, money laundering, and possession of illegal narcotics. Chloe screamed hysterically. Her fake perfect life was literally being dragged away in steel handcuffs. She ran toward me, throwing herself onto the cold marble floor right at my feet. She grabbed the hem of my emerald silk suit, sobbing uncontrollably. "Maya, please," Chloe begged, looking up at me with mascara running down her tear-soaked face. "You cannot do this. We are sisters. Please help me. I have nothing left." I looked down at the golden child, the sister who had happily sent me to a federal prison to protect her dirty money. I slowly reached down and effortlessly peeled her trembling fingers off my suit. "I will send you a postcard, Chloe," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "If I remember." I turned my back on her weeping form. I looked at my parents one last time. They were sitting on the floor of their ruined empire, surrounded by the judgmental stares of the elite friends they had sacrificed me to impress. They had lost their wealth, their home, and their absolute most prized possession, their flawless reputation. They were completely and utterly broken. I did not stay to watch the federal agents finish their job. I walked smoothly down the center aisle, the crowd of wealthy guests parting silently to let me through. The heavy wooden doors stood wide open, welcoming the cold, refreshing rain. I stepped out onto the porch, pulling the crisp night air deep into my lungs. I walked straight to my waiting armored vehicle, leaving the total destruction of my toxic family behind me in the glittering ruins of their own making. I stepped into the Atlanta night completely untouchable and absolutely